Some time ago I created a video to show how much income you could expect to get from different sized pots of money. And although lots of people found it very helpful, some did say it doesn't paint a complete picture because it doesn't take into account all factors. I was simply showing how much could be drawn from the pot itself without it running out. But our total income potential is different. And that's what I'm going to talk about in today's video. Knowing how much income you're in line for in retirement, or how much is enough, are questions that keep people awake at night. So understanding how you can work that out with confidence is going to make life a lot easier. I'll explain how you can do that, but I'll also tell you the key factors that will influence certain decisions depending on the size of pot that you have. Finally, I'll tell you the measures that can improve your chances of success and the surprising thing that actually won't. Now we're going to focus on 3 different pot sizes: 250k, 500k and £1 million. I'll go through various factors that will influence how much income we can take as we go along, and we'll build this table to eventually arrive at some sustainable income figures. It's important for me to say that this is still intended as a guide though. They're not guaranteed amounts. So the assumptions we'll use are that withdrawals will start at age 55 and they'll continue until age 95, the assumed mortality age. I know a lot of you will say, well, I'll be long gone by then, but this is just an example. It's better to forecast a long time frame because you don't want to run out too soon. A chap I once knew was told he had 2 years left to live, so he just went and blew all his money having a good time. But he was still here 10 years later and penniless, trying to latch onto any rich woman he could find. The investments are 60% invested in global equities or stocks and 40% in fixed income and bonds. The historical average return for that split of holdings over the past 100 years has been around 8% a year. So that's what we'll use as an assumed annual growth rate. It's certainly no guarantee of growth. We're just using historic data. The money is all in pensions because that's the most likely place people hold their retirement savings, and all withdrawals are before tax. Finally, annual charges are assumed to be 1% a year. We'll start with a maximum withdrawal you could take from a 250k pension pot. Voyant, the plan modelling software I use, will actually work this spending capacity out, which is very helpful. I've put a link in the description about how you can access this software too, but it tells us that the amount is £14,648. Now you might be thinking, well, if my return is 8% a year and charges are 1%, surely I can take 7% out of that 250k pot every year, which would be £17,500. Well, the reason you can't is because of inflation. We've assumed that the cost of living will increase by 2% a year over the timeline. That's the Bank of England target. So the number we see is £14,648, but it increases every year by 2% to make sure the spending power of the money remains the same. As you can see here, if we highlighted age 75 on the chart, the actual withdrawal is £21,766 in that year. But that would buy you as much as £14,648 today, assuming 2% annual inflation. So it's a useful starting point to know what the maximum spending capacity out of your pot is. But what about other elements of your situation that can influence the total income you're able to achieve? And how secure would that level of withdrawal really be? Well, I'll come back to the security aspect shortly, but your total income is going to be influenced by other sources of income and capital. If we're talking about household income, we may need to include a partner's income and capital too. Your situation is your situation though, and it's going to be different to the next person's, which is why it's important to create your own plan based on your own numbers. What I'm going to do though is assume that instead of just one person, we've got a couple, and they'll both receive a full state pension at 67 years old. Those are the only other incomes I'll include, but obviously every other facet of your own situation will impact on your personal income potential. So how much do you think introducing state pensions into the mix will change how much you can take from your personal pension in the early years? Well, the answer might not be what you expect, because it really depends on your goal. If that is still to make the money last over the full timeline and get the most you can in each individual year, it doesn't really change anything. The most you'll be able to get is still £14,648 for the first 12 years, and then that amount plus your state pensions for the remaining years. You could take more from your personal pension initially. In fact, you could take £26,680 a year until the state pensions kicked in if you wanted to, but that would totally exhaust the pot, and all you'd then be left with is the state pensions themselves. The more you take initially, the less you'll have available when those incomes start. And that might be absolutely fine, but it needs to be considered when making plans. From age 67 onwards, though, the maximum income capacity this household would have, in today's terms, is around £37,652 a year. But how certain could you be of that income? After all, the spending capacity assumes you spend your last penny on your dying day. Well, to get a better idea of this, we use something called a Monte Carlo simulation. What this does is show your chance of succeeding with any given level of withdrawal. And by succeeding, I mean not running out of money. So by telling Voyant that we plan to take £14,648 a year from our pension, it tells us that our chance of success is just 5%. You're much more likely to fail than succeed. So why is that? Well, it's because the average return isn't what you get every year. Success or failure rests on your sequence of returns. A bit like in a relay race. If your first runner gets off to a bad start, your other runners have got to work really hard to catch up. And even if they perform well, more often than not, the team will still lose the race. Same with investing. If the growth you get in the early years is negative, it can do irreparable damage to your chances of success. And that is what this simulation is showing us. It's using real historic data to project a range of outcomes based on how equities and bonds have performed in the past. And it uses something called standard deviation to measure this. If you're not familiar with what that is, let me give you an analogy. Imagine a professional darts player aiming for the treble 20. He's going to hit somewhere in that treble 20 probably 2/3 of the time. If he doesn't, he'll be close to it. So he's going to be around that treble, somewhere in the 20, the 5 or the 1, at least 95 times out of 100. Very occasionally, you might be a bit further away, but it will be a scoring throw, let's say 99 times out of 100. Then there'll be the odd freak event where the dart bounces out of the board or something. And this is what standard deviation looks like. If the last 100 darts thrown were somehow still in the board, you'd have this cluster of them in the treble 20, with a slightly more sparse cluster outside of it, and then a few outliers. If the person throwing the darts was me, though, the spread would be much wider. You'd still have clusters around the target, but the range wouldn't be as tight. If you apply this to investment returns, standard deviation measures how much the annual return in your stocks or bonds is expected to deviate around the average. Based on forecasts I'm seeing at the moment, standard deviation for global equities is around 15%, and for global bonds, it's around 4%. That means that if the average return on equities was 10% a year, you'd expect somewhere between 25% and -5%. That would be like me throwing the darts. If the average return on bonds was 5% a year, you'd normally expect a return between 9% and 1%. That would be Luke Littler throwing the darts. Much lower risk, much tighter range. If the return is within that range, it's said to be within one standard deviation. And we know that it will be 68% of the time. It will be within 2 standard deviations 95% of the time, and within 3, 99.7% of the time. So applying this back to the Monte Carlo simulation, it's randomizing thousands of investment return sequences within these standard deviations to tell us our chance of success. The purple dotted line shows the midpoint, and the top and bottom of the lighter shading shows the likely best and worst case scenarios. As you can see, the range of probabilities widens a lot as time goes by. That's what's called a fat tail of probability. The further we look into the future, the less certain we can be of any particular outcome. But one thing we can see is that as time goes on, the likelihood of running out of money becomes greater and greater. Now, a 5% probability of success is clearly way too low to have any confidence in your plan long term. So what level of probability would be enough to make us comfortable? Well, some of you might say, well, 100%. But I don't think that's strictly necessary, not least because we can never be 100% certain of anything anyway. In my previous video on this topic, I used 95% in my assumptions, but I actually think we could still go slightly lower than that and say anywhere from 85% upwards. And I'll tell you why. The plan we create today is unlikely to rigidly remain the plan for the rest of our lives. We'll come back and review it every year. If we have a good year, our probability of success next year will be higher anyway, because we'll have more money than expected and one less year to worry about. If we have a bad year, We may not do anything, but we may make some slight adjustments to improve our prospects if we feel it's necessary. For example, we might use some cash we've put in reserve to cover all or part of our income needs for a while, and that will take pressure off the investments. We can always re-strategize to remain on course. That's why we review. So 85% is probably enough of a long-term probability to give us confidence. If I was to alter the withdrawal to a level that gave us this chance of success, the reduction needed is probably not quite as much as you'd imagine. A withdrawal of £13,000 a year, increasing with inflation of course, gave an 88% probability of success. You'd therefore have total income capacity with state pensions from age 67 of £36,004 a year. And that should give you an idea of a more sustainable withdrawal. It's only a guide, of course, based on the assumptions I've used. If we were to populate the table with numbers from the other pot sizes, they'd look like this. The maximum spending capacity on a 500k pot would be £27,383, which would, of course, be total income of £50,387 with 2 full state pensions when both partners are 67. Reducing the withdrawal to get 85% minimum probability of success, however, would take it down to £24,500 a year and total income of £47,504 at 67. And the numbers would be £51,641 maximum on a £1 million pot and £74,645 from state pension age, reduced to £46,000 and total future income capacity of £69,004 to meet an 85% probability of success. I just want to reiterate that the larger annual numbers are only from when both state pensions have started. That's not the figure you could take straight away if you retired at 55 in these examples. And the more you took initially, the lower that future income capacity would be. Now, the likelihood of someone with a £1 million pot, or even a 500k pot, having no other assets at all is pretty unlikely, I'd say. Which is why I'll say again, you need to perform this exercise yourself, inputting your own circumstances. It's possible to do that using the tools I've used in this video, and I've put more information on that in the description below. But this matrix should give you an idea of a sustainable income level, as well as your kind of headroom if you did need to spend a bit more temporarily. I said at the start that I talk about key considerations in addition to just income levels at different size pots. So what are they? Well, as you can imagine, income is just a starting point. You'll need to choose an appropriate investment strategy. There'll be tax to think about and how you can reduce that both now and in the future. And there'll be other factors unique to your own situation. Your pot size will influence those decisions though. If you've got a smaller pot that you'll be very reliant on, for example, your capacity for loss will be lower, which means your investment strategy will need to be more cautious. And that means it will be less capable of producing high returns. Also, there'll be a higher priority for paying off existing debt, like mortgages, when you have a smaller fund, because you'll be more sensitive to interest rate changes. That's because your mortgage payments will take up a larger part of your total income. So any increase to those payments will have a greater impact on you than someone who has a bigger pot and higher potential income. People with larger pots will probably have more concern about things like inheritance tax, especially given the recently announced changes to rules. And these are all potential reasons to either take advice or at least make sure you've got the right tools to create a well thought out plan. Is there anything we can do though to improve our income prospects from the pots we've built up? Well, one way of course is to shorten the time horizon you're projecting over. Some of you might think that both the retirement age of 55 and a mortality age of 95 are a bit ambitious. Shortening the time period to 30 years does make quite a difference to the numbers, as you can see on screen now. Word of warning here though, we don't know how long we're going to live, so always best to err on the side of caution. Anything you can do, of course, to secure extra income or make additional contributions will help. But could you also increase your income potential by having more stocks in your portfolio? Surely by having higher growth potential, our income prospects are improved too. Well, if we have a quick look again at the Monte Carlo simulator, dialing up the equity content hardly has any impact on the probability of success. All it really does is widen the range of possible outcomes. Worth bearing that in mind when you're thinking about how to invest in retirement. I did talk about some clients though in a recent video who wanted to push the boundaries of their income in retirement. If you want to see how we did that, check this video out next, because I go through the process that we followed to make their very high income target possible with a pot that was smaller than you might think would be needed. I'll see you there.